Welcome to the spaces where the glittering facades of our world peel away to reveal the rot underneath. We are drawn to the bright lights, to the promise of reinvention, to the idea that if we follow the rules, or cleverly break them, we will find our place in the world. But what happens when the pursuit of an identity turns into a ravenous monster? What happens when those sworn to protect us use us as disposable pawns in a lethal game of chess? Tonight, we are descending into 3 distinct nightmares. We will walk through the blood-soaked, neon-lit dance floors of 1992's Manhattan. We will descend into a concrete bunker in the rural mountains of South Korea. And we will drive down a dead-end road in the suffocating heat of the Florida swamplands. Settle into the darkness. Knock your doors. Let's begin. Part I, the Blood Feast. If you closed your eyes and listened to New York City in the late 1980s and early 1990s, you would hear a frantic, synthetic heartbeat. The nightlife scene was an explosion of glitter, strobe lights, and absolute, unchecked rebellion. It was a world engineered to blur the rigid lines of reality, transforming public spaces into theater, and human beings into walking works of art. At the absolute epicenter of this glittering chaos was a tribe known as the Club Kids. They were a band of flamboyant, hardcore partygoers who weaponized fashion and attitude. And pulling the strings of this chaotic circus was a man named Michael Alec. But to understand the monster Michael became, you have to look at the boy he was. Born in South Bend, Indiana, in the spring of 1966, Michael's early years were defined by alienation. Following the bitter divorce of his parents, he drifted into a profound sense of otherness. He possessed a sharp mind, graduating near the very top of his high school class, but his intellect offered no armor against the relentless, brutal bullying he endured because of his homosexuality. He was a quiet, shy kid, forced to live in the suffocating shadows of a conservative town. But Michael was desperate for a metamorphosis. In 1984, he escaped to the only place that promised absolute freedom, New York City. Enrolling first at Fordham University and later the Fashion Institute of Technology, Michael didn't just dip his toes into the Manhattan underground. He drowned himself in it. He began at the bottom, sweeping floors and clearing glasses as a busboy at Downsteria. But Michael was magnetic. He possessed a relentless, histrionic energy. Soon, he caught the eye of club owners and was elevated to a promoter at the Limelight. The Limelight was a deconsecrated Gothic church repurposed into a cathedral of sin. It was a place where patrons flocked to the altar of live performances by icons like Grace Jones, Marilyn Manson, and Cyndi Lauper. Backed by the club's ownership, Michael was given the keys to the kingdom. He curated wildly boundary-pushing themed events, packing the dance floors shoulder to shoulder. He gathered a loyal inner circle of misfits artists and outcasts. This was the birth of the Club Kids. The roster included names that would become legendary in the counterculture. DJ Kyokayo, James Street, James Richie Rich, Michelle Visage, Andrew Paul. To the vast majority of these individuals, the Club Kids represented a sanctuary, a safe, vibrant space to express their authentic selves without fear of judgment. But Michael viewed it differently. The Club Kids were his vehicle for psychological vengeance. He utilized the scene to shed the skin of the bullied boy from Indiana and resurrect himself as a louder-than-life, untouchable provocateur. He wanted attention, and he didn't care if it was fueled by adoration or disgust. The aesthetic of the Club Kids was deliberately disorienting. They dressed in grotesque, elaborate costumes, painting their faces in ways that defied human anatomy. They pioneered the outlaw party. Dressed like alien royalty, they would swarm mundane public spaces, Dunkin' Donuts, Burger King, ATM vestibules, and the cramped cars of the New York City subway system. They would blast deafening music from heavy boomboxes, transforming fast food restaurants into raves until the sirens wailed and the police arrived to scatter them. The stunts grew darker. In one deeply exploitative instance, Michael threw a massive party inside a makeshift homeless encampment, a shantytown built of cardboard and scrap metal. He paid the destitute residents for the use of their venue in crack cocaine. Narcotics were the lifeblood of this empire. Drugs lured the patrons through the church doors and fueled the 24-hour lifestyles of the Club Kids themselves. By the end of the decade, Michael Alec had effectively usurped Andy Warhol's throne as the reigning king of New York nightlife. But as his fame skyrocketed, his empathy plummeted. He developed a reputation for vile, degrading behavior. He would urinate on his own guests, or secretly relieve himself into their expensive cocktails. He would stand on balconies overlooking the packed dance floors and drain $100 bills down on the crowd, laughing hysterically as the desperate clubgoers trampled each other and threw punches just to grab the cashish. He would launch his own body into the crowd, violently tackling patrons to the floor, just for the thrill of the impact. He was obsessed with the macabre. Channeling his love for horror cinema, Michael hosted a blood feast party at the Limelight, decorating the cavernous, vaulted ceilings and stone walls with hyper-realistic severed limbs. The media ate it up. The club kids became national spectacles, appearing on daytime television shows like Geraldo and The Joan Rivers Show. But the glitter was a thin veneer over a rotting core of severe addiction. Michael was consuming massive, daily quantities of ecstasy, heroin, and Special K. Through this chemical haze, Michael formed a transcational relationship with a young drug dealer named Andre Melendez. In the clubs, Andre went by the moniker Angel, a name inspired by the massive, feathered wings he strapped to his back. Angel desperately wanted to belong. He wanted the fame, the access, the validation of being a recognized club kid. To buy his way into Michael's good graces, Angel supplied the promoter with heavy narcotics at steep discounts. Eventually, the dealer moved his belongings into Michael's riverbank apartment on West 43rd Street. It was a fatal mistake. As Michael sank deeper into the abyss of his addictions, his debts skyrocketed. By the spring of 1996, he owed Angel a significant amount of money. On March 17th, the tension finally snapped. Angel confronted Michael inside the claustrophobic walls of the riverbank apartment, demanding the cash he was owed. Also present in the room was another club kid and roommate, Robert Triggs, who operated under the chillingly appropriate alias Freeze. The argument ignited into a screaming match, and then a physical brawl. According to subsequent court testimonies and Freeze's own detailed confession, the violence escalated with terrifying speed. As the two men wrestled, Michael screamed out for his roommate to help him. Freeze didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy metal hammer. He approached Angel from behind and brought the steel head crashing down into the dealer's skull. He struck him once, twice, 3 times. Angel collapsed, but Michael wasn't finished. He grabbed a couch pillow and forced it over Angel's bleeding face, pressing his weight down to suffocate him. The details that follow were testified to by Michael himself, though he would later attempt to legally retract them. He claimed he found a bottle of Drano, a highly toxic, caustic drain cleaner. He filled a medical syringe with the corrosive chemical and plunged it directly into Angel's veins. He then pried the dying man's jaw open, poured the remaining Drano down his throat, stuffed a heavy rag into his mouth, and wrapped multiple layers of thick duct tape around his head to seal the chemical burns inside. To this day, it remains medically unclear which specific act extinguished Angel's life: the blunt force trauma to the brain, the catastrophic chemical burns eroding his internal organs, or the lack of oxygen. Once Angel's body finally stopped twitching, the reality of the slaughter set in. The two killers dragged the heavy, bleeding corpse into the bathroom and unceremoniously dumped it into the porcelain bathtub. Michael poured boxes of baking soda over the remains to mask the scent of decomposition, while Freeze hauled bags of ice into the room, burying Angel beneath the frozen cubes. With the body hidden just feet away, Michael and Freeze walked back into the living room, picked up their drugs, and continued getting high husband. They lived with the corpse for an entire week, but eventually, the ice melted. The baking soda failed. The thick, sweet, horrifying stench of rotting human flesh began to permeate the apartment, seeping into the hallway. They needed to dispose of the evidence. Freeze offered Michael a sinister bargain. He would give him 10 bags of heroin if Michael handled the butchery. Michael, desperate for the chemical release, accepted the deal. He acquired a set of knives and went to work in the bloody bathtub. He surgically severed Angel's legs from his torso. He packed the amputated limbs into a heavy canvas duffel bag, carried it out into the New York City night, and casually tossed it into a random street dumpster. He then wrapped the mutilated torso, shoved it into a large cardboard box, sealed the seams with heavy tape, and transported it to the edge of the water, heaving it into the dark, freezing currents of the Hudson River. In the weeks that followed, Michael Alec did not lay low. He did not hide. Instead, he returned to the clubs, dancing under the strobe lights. The arrogance of the monster had completely eclipsed his sense of self-preservation. He began openly confessing to the murder. He whispered it into the ears of patrons over the thumping bass of the dance floor. In a display of sociopathic theatricality, he actually took a marker and scrawled the word guilty across his own forehead for a party. He made bizarre, thinly veiled slip-ups during magazine interviews. His friends and acolytes brushed it off. They assumed it was just Michael being Michael, a desperate, macabre performance to keep the spotlight burning. And while it was undeniably a cry for attention, it was also the absolute truth. Deep down, a twisted fragment of Michael's psychology actually wanted to be arrested, simply because a murder trial would etch his name into the annals of New York history forever. He believed he was untouchable, and for 9 long months he was. Until the currents of the water betrayed him. A group of children playing along the shores of Staten Island noticed a battered, waterlogged box washed up in the surf. Curiosity taking hold, they ripped the soggy cardboard open. They were greeted by the horrific, bloated sight of a human torso with no legs. The investigation was initially paralyzed. The coroner severely misidentified the ethnicity of the remains, and the notoriously poor communication between the different borough police departments caused the files to gather dust. Meanwhile, the Village Voice published a blind gossip item, heavily implying that the king of the club kids was responsible for the disappearance of the winged drug dealer. By November of 1996, dental records officially confirmed that the torso belonged to Andre Angel Melendez. The authorities finally stopped treating Michael A. Lake's drug-fueled boasts as performance art and started treating them as a confession. But as the net tightened, the untouchable king panicked. He fled the city. Detectives tracked him down to a cheap, nondescript motel room in Toms River, New Jersey. On December 5th, 9 months after the hammer strikes, Michael Alec was placed in handcuffs. Freeze was apprehended shortly after. Initially, the district attorney hesitated to throw the book at Michael. They wanted to use him as a star witness to dismantle the club ownership, hoping he would testify against his bosses for facilitating the massive drug rings inside the limelight. But the public outcry was deafening. The media demanded justice for Angel. Cornered, claiming that the heavy narcotics had erased their memories of the butchery, both Michael and Freeze accepted a plea deal. They pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. The judge handed down a sentence of 10 to 20 years behind bars. The empire crumbled. The limelight went dark. The club kids scattered into the wind, their reputations irreparably stained by the blood of their associate. Prison did not break Michael Alec. It simply bored him. He was repeatedly thrown into solitary confinement after testing positive for illicit substances behind bars, complaining that a sober life in a cell was too tedious to endure. He spent roughly 5 years in total isolation, passing the time by penning his memoirs, arrogantly titled Aligula. Even locked in a cage, he refused to let the spotlight fade. He granted controversial interviews to journalists, undictated social media posts through friends on the outside. His parole was denied twice. The board cited his failed drug tests, but they were also heavily influenced by the release of the 2003 Hollywood film Party Monster, a glossy dramatization of the murder, starring Macaulay Culkin, in that arguably glorified his toxic legacy. Finally, on May 5, 2014, after serving 17 years, the gates opened. Michael Alec stepped out onto the streets of a New York City he no longer recognized. He attempted a comeback. He painted. He launched a media presence. He even recorded a song. But the public reaction was icy. Critics watched him closely, searching his eyes for a flicker of genuine, agonizing remorse for the life he extinguished. They found none. He seemed entirely focused on monetizing his infamy. Any benefit of the doubt evaporated when he sat down for an interview near a body of water. Looking at the camera, Michael smirked and said, "What a nice place to dump a disposable body. That'll be a great job. We should come back every year and see the evolution. We should throw another body. We should throw a body over here or here." He later tried to wave the comment away as a mechanism of dark humor. But the truth was written in his sneer. 17 years in a concrete box had not rehabilitated his soul. It had only taught him that if he could no longer be famous for throwing a party, he would gladly settle for being famous for destroying a life. The curtain finally fell on Christmas Eve, 2020. At the age of 54, Michael Alec was found dead in his Manhattan apartment, a fatal overdose. His life was not a glamorous tale of excess. It was a terrifying case study of a man who equated notoriety with actual human value. He transformed himself from a victim into a predator, leaving behind a legacy that serves as a chilling reminder. The pursuit of absolute reinvention can sometimes lead to absolute self-destruction. Part II, the Supreme Gangsters. Our next descent takes us away from the neon glow of New York and into the shadows of a rapidly changing nation. Listen closely to the words echoing through the heavy, smoke-filled air of a seedy, underground poker den. Once you join us, there's no getting out. Anyone who betrays the gang will be executed. I'll sleep with my chest exposed. If you want to leave, stab me in the heart. If you can't do that, I'll hunt you to the edge of hell. The man speaking these chilling vows was Kim Ji-Hwan. He sat at a dimly lit table, his eyes burning with a fanatical intensity, staring down 6 desperate men. They hadn't gathered in this damp room simply to gamble away their meager wages. They were drafting the manifesto for a violent class revolution. They were forming a cult of blood and resentment. They called themselves the Kaijun Part. For these men, the phrase "eat the rich" was not a political metaphor. It was a culinary directive. To comprehend the sheer madness of the Kaijun Pa, you must understand the whiplash of South Korea's economic history. In the decades following the Korean War, the 1952 and 60s, the peninsula was utterly devastated. It was one of the poorest, most fractured nations on the globe. Families were starving, the infrastructure was reduced to ash, and survival depended heavily on foreign aid. But then, the 1972 arrived, bringing an aggressive, state-driven economic miracle. The government poured unimaginable resources into heavy industry, steel production, and technological education. Almost overnight, the agrarian landscape was paved over. By the 1982s, South Korea was a booming powerhouse, showcasing its newfound wealth to the world. During the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the cities pulsed with neon, highways spider-webbed across the mountains, and a massive new middle class was suddenly drowning in cash. But progress always leaves a shadow, and in that shadow were the rural, uneducated working class. They had been left choking on the exhaust fumes of the country's success. Kim Ji-Hwan was born into that shadow, in the rural town of Yangon. He was a brilliant, highly capable student, but his intellect was suffocated by crushing poverty. After his father died, his childhood was defined by gnawing hunger and ragged clothes. Despite showing immense promise in writing and athletics, Ji-Hwan was forced to abandon his education in his teenage years to financially support his ailing mother and brother. He broke his back in coal mines and choked on factory dust. In the early 1990s, he migrated to Seoul, searching for a piece of the miracle. Instead, the wealth gap shattered his psyche. Ji-Hwan found himself working 16-hour days, forced to sleep on the cold concrete streets in sweat-stained overalls, while a new breed of wealthy yuppies paraded past him in designer suits, stepping into luxury imported cars. They looked at him with disgust. They saw him as dirt. His resentment festered, but it metastasized into pure hatred when he learned a sickening secret. The prestigious universities of the nation were actively selling academic placements belonging to poor students to the highest wealthy bidders. The game was rigged. The society was rotting from the top down. Ji-Hwan retreated to his hometown, his mind boiling with violent purpose. He was going to build an army to punish the privileged. In April of 1993, at that underground poker table, he recruited his soldiers. Kang Dong-Yuen, Kim Hyun-Yang, Kang Moon-Sip, Moon Sang-ok, Big Bio-in-ok, and Song Bong-woo. This ragtag crew shared identical scars. They were all uneducated, trapped in menial labor, suffocating under gambling debts, possessing minor criminal records, and harboring a deep, violent resentment toward anyone who had a comfortable life. They swore a blood oath to cleanse the nation of its filth, which they defined as anyone who lived well and walked with an air of arrogance. They established 3 absolute, unbreakable laws. Hate the rich. Kill all traitors. Never trust a woman, not even your own mother. G.I. Huan originally named the cult mosque, and he arrogantly believed it was the ancient Greek word for ambition. In reality, he had horribly mistranslated an Arabic word roughly meaning house. When they realized the embarrassing linguistic error, they rebranded it as the Kaijon Po, which translates to the Supreme Gangsters. Their master plan was terrifying in its scope. They intended to raise 1 billion won, roughly $2 million, through extortion and kidnapping. They would use that war chest to purchase heavy weaponry and unleash a nationwide massacre against the wealthy elite. But G.I. Huan knew his men needed to cross the psychological threshold of murder before they could start a war. They needed a practice run. On July 18, 1993, the gang lurked beneath a train overpass in Nonsang. They spotted a 23-year-old bank clerk named Choi Mi-yo walking alone. She was not a wealthy elite. She was the humble daughter of a farmer. She was chosen completely at random. They ambushed her, dragging her into their vehicle. They drove her deep into the wilderness of Mount Jiri, a towering, isolated peak the gang used for physical endurance training. In the absolute isolation of the mountain, they brutalized the young woman. Once they were finished, G.I. Huan gathered his men around like a professor addressing a classroom. "I'll now show you all how to kill," he stated coldly. With his followers watching in stunned silence, G.I. Huan wrapped his hands around Mija's throat and squeezed the life from her body. They abandoned her corpse on the dirt and drove away. This arbitrary, senseless slaughter immediately exposed the Kaijon Pof, or what they truly were. They were not Robin Hood revolutionaries fighting for the working class. They were a hypocritical death cult fueled by misogyny and sadism. But the brutal reality of the murder fractured the mind of their youngest recruit. 18-year-old Song Bong-woo was tormented by terrifying night terrors. He saw Mija's ghost standing at the foot of his bed, her dead eyes staring through him. The teenager realized he had made a catastrophic mistake. He wanted out. In August, driven by panic, Bong-woo raided the gang's treasury, stealing 3 million won, and fled for his life. His escape lasted exactly 2 hours. The gang tracked him to his parents' home. They knocked on the door, smiled warmly, and offered a full olive branch. They told the terrified boy that all was forgiven, coaxing him into their vehicle for a reconciliation dinner. They did not drive to a restaurant. They drove back up the winding, dark roads of Mount Jiri. When the car tires crunched to a halt in the wilderness, G.I. Huan stepped out. He looked at the trembling teenager and calmly recited rule number 2, kill all traitors. G.I. Huan didn't have to lift a finger. His indoctrinated soldiers retrieved heavy, iron pickaxes they had hidden in the brush. They surrounded the weeping 18-year-old and hacked him to pieces. They mutilated his remains until he was unrecognizable, doused the flesh in accelerant, and burned him to ash before burying the bones. The blood pact was sealed. To celebrate their successful purge, the gang caught a stray dog, roasted it over a fire, and ate it, with G.I. Huan laughing that they had put 2 dogs down that day. The operation rapidly expanded. They pooled their meager wages, fenced stolen merchandise, and stockpiled firearms, explosives, and vehicles. They utilized their construction skills to transform the rural home of G.I. Huan's mother into a fortress of horrors. They affectionately called it the Pink House. To the passing neighbors, it looked like a quirky remodeling project. But beneath the floorboards, they had constructed a subterranean slaughterhouse. The bunker featured reinforced concrete walls, soundproof prison cells for holding hostages, and a massive, custom-built iron incineration chamber to dispose of the evidence. Before the dungeon could be fully utilized, a massive hiccup occurred. The intellectual leader, Kim Ji-I Huan, was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in a penitentiary. But he wasn't caught for the murders. The night before killing Mia, the revolutionary leader had assaulted a middle school girl. From his prison cell, G.I. Huan continued to direct the cult, ordering his men to raise more funds, so they could eventually attack the police station and break him out. On September 7, 1994, The gang was hunting on the roads of Yangsuri. A sleek Hyundai, grandiosed, and glided past them. To the Kaijonpa, this car was a flashing beacon of upper-class wealth. They swerved their trucks, forcing the sedan off the road. They dragged the terrified occupants, 26-year-old Lee Soon-young and her 36-year-old boyfriend, Lee Jong-won, out of the vehicle, bound their wrists, gagged them, and hauled them down into the newly constructed dungeon. But, as they interrogated the couple in the damp, concrete cell, the gangsters realized they had made a colossal, embarrassing error. The couple was not rich. Soon-young was a waitress in a local cafe. Jong-won was a struggling musician. The luxury car was an older model. They had scraped together just enough money to buy second-hand. Furious at their own mistake, the gang decided they couldn't let them go. They forced Jong-won to consume lethal amounts of alcohol. They strapped a plastic bag over his head and, in a display of agonizing psychological torture, forced Soon-young to place her hands over her lover's mouth to help suffocate him. Weeping hysterically, she complied, though applying no actual pressure, while the monsters laughed at her trauma. Growing bored, the gang produced high-voltage tasers and electrocuted the musician until his heart stopped, leaving deep, charred burn marks across his skin. They loaded Jong-won's corpse into the driver's seat of the Hyundai, drove to the edge of a steep ravine, and pushed the car into the abyss. When the police found the wreckage smelling of cheap liquor, they immediately ruled it a tragic drunk driving accident. Soon-young, however, was kept alive. She was locked in the subterranean cells, kept as a plaything for the sociopaths. Less than a week later, on September 13th, the gang struck again. They stalked a cemetery and abducted a couple paying their respects, So Yuno and his wife, Pak Min. This time, the target did possess wealth. Oh was the president of a machinery company. However, the wealth was an illusion. The business was modest, and he was drowning in debt from the factory's acquisition. Dragging them into the bunker, the gang strapped dynamite to Oh's chest and ordered him to go out and collect a ransom of 100 million won, roughly $250,000. Desperate, Oh called a colleague, begging him to gather 80 million won for a fabricated urgent medical treatment. When Oh met the colleague to collect the cash, he whispered a desperate plea, "I've been kidnapped. Don't follow me." The colleague immediately dialed the authorities. It was a golden opportunity to stop the madness, but the police response was a catastrophic failure of bureaucracy. Departments bickered over jurisdiction. The report was tossed between desks, and absolutely no action was taken. Oh returned to the dungeon with the briefcases of cash, believing he was purchasing his wife's freedom. He was wrong. The manifesto demanded blood. The gang retrieved their prisoner, Soon-young. They shoved a heavy air rifle into her trembling hands, aimed it at Oh's head, and forced her to pull the trigger. The businessman fell dead. Immediately after, the gang took an axe and butchered his screaming wife, Pak Min. What followed was a descent into absolute, unrecoverable madness. The gang dismembered the bodies. They fired up the backyard grill, mixed the human remains with pork meat, and held a neighborhood barbecue. They forced Soon-young to chew and swallow the roasted flesh of the people she had just watched die. The gang claimed the cannibalism was a spiritual ritual necessary to completely strip away their remaining humanity. Flushed with cash and high on bloodlust, the Kaijonpa purchased a stolen VIP registry from a corrupt corporate staffer. The list contained the names and home addresses of the wealthiest citizens in the country. The nationwide massacre was about to begin. But the downfall of the supreme gangsters would come from the very woman they forced to eat human flesh. Trapped in the dungeon for 8 agonizing days, Soon-young realized her only chance at survival was psychological warfare. She focused her attention on 22-year-old Kim Hyan-young. Hyan-yang was the cult's resident misogynist, the very man who drafted the rule to never trust a woman. His hatred stemmed from feeling abandoned by his mother after his father's death. But criminal psychologist Slater noted a fatal flaw in his psyche. His misogyny was a mask. He desperately, pathologically craved a mother's love. Soon-young weaponized this vulnerability. Despite the horrors around her, she feigned a severe case of Stockholm Syndrome. She treated Hyan-yang with a soft, gentle kindness. He began addressing her respectfully as Missy. He sat outside her cell and shared deep, personal childhood traumas with her. He actively argued against his fellow gang members when they suggested killing her. On September 16, 1994, the break arrived. While handling the explosives for their upcoming terror campaign, a detonator misfired, severely injuring Hyan Yang's hand. Soon Young rushed to his side, playing the role of the nurturing mother, and insisted she accompany him to the hospital to ensure he was okay. He agreed. In the clinical white halls of the hospital, Hyan Yang did something utterly baffling. He handed Soon Young a wad of cash equivalent to $700 and a mobile phone. He looked at her, his injured hand bleeding, and whispered, "Do you want to run away? Do you want to escape? Now's your chance." He quickly added a manipulative caveat, reminding her that she had pulled the trigger on the businessman. He told her that in the eyes of the law, she was a murderer to her. There was nowhere to run. Experts debate whether this was a twisted test of her loyalty or a flicker of genuine mercy. Hyan Young arrogantly believed his psychological conditioning was absolute. He thought his new mother would never abandon him. He severely underestimated the sheer titanium will of Soon Young. The absolute second Hyan Young walked into the treatment room, Soon Young turned on her. Heelan sprinted through the hospital doors. She flagged down a taxi, jumped into the back seat, and screamed at the driver to step on the gas, confessing she was fleeing from a violent gang. The driver, trying to make conversation, casually mentioned that he was well acquainted with all the local thugs in the area. Panic seized Soon Young's chest. In a region controlled by the Kaijonpa, she couldn't trust the driver being an informant. She demanded he pull over at a rural vineyard. She jumped out and dialed the police on the mobile phone. The response was a sickening repeat of history. The dispatchers coldly told her she was calling the wrong jurisdiction and hung up. Running on pure adrenaline, she convinced the vineyard owner to rent her a car. She drove to the city of Daejeon, abandoned the vehicle in case she was being tracked, hailed a new taxi, and made the grueling journey all the way to the capital city of Seoul. She burst through the doors of the Sicho police station and collapsed, frantically detailing the dungeon, the murders, the dynamite, and the cannibalism. The duty officers rolled their eyes. They looked at the disheveled, frantic woman and assumed she was suffering from a severe narcotic psychosis. They were about to throw her out. But as she hysterically recounted the torture of her boyfriend, she mentioned the high-voltage taser. An older, senior detective stopped dead in his tracks. He remembered the baffling, unexplained burn marks found on the corpse of the drunk driver in the ravine weeks earlier. The puzzle pieces locked together. The authorities finally unsheathed their swords. On September 17th, the oblivious gang recruited a young woman named Lee Jong-soo to cook and clean the bunker. It was a historically bad day to join the cult. 2 days later, the police descended on the Pink House like a localized hurricane. The raid was swift and absolute. As the doors were kicked in, Hyan Yang, realizing his mother had betrayed him and brought the wrath of the state to their doorstep, attempted to detonate a massive stack of dynamite and blow himself to kingdom come. He was tackled before he could light the fuse. Inside the concrete bunker, the investigators uncovered an armory of stole and military-grade weapons. Inside the heavy iron incinerator, they found the charred, cooked bone fragments of the innocent victims. The media explosion was unprecedented. The newspapers branded the Kaijonpa as South Korea's Manson family. As the men were paraded before the flashbulbs in handcuffs, they displayed a chilling absolute lack of remorse. They spat at the cameras, screaming that the corrupt society had forced their hands. One member openly lamented that he hadn't butchered more rich people. Another smiled and bragged to the reporters about the sweet taste of human flesh. Before the trial commenced, the state released the results of their psychological evaluations. With the exception of the mastermind, G.I. Hwon, every single member of the terrifying Kaijonpa scored in the low 90 seconds on their IQ tests. Prison guards noted that the fearsome revolutionaries were actually shockingly simple-minded, easily manipulated pawns who had been entirely brainwashed by a slightly smarter sociopath. But stupidity is not a defense for slaughter. The public was out for blood, demanding retribution not just for the murders, but for the catastrophic incompetence of the police who had ignored the warnings. The trial was a blur. By October 31st, 1994, All the male members of the cult were found guilty and sentenced to hang. The sole female member, who had joined days prior and hadn't killed anyone, was given a 3-year sentence. On November 2nd, 1995, the trapdoors opened, and the supreme gangsters met the end of a rope. The state rightfully recognized that Soon Young was a victim acting under unimaginable coercion, and she was not charged. She was given a quiet home in the countryside to heal. But the trauma did not end. Sensationalist journalists hunted her down like wild dogs, shoving microphones in her face to ask vile questions about the taste of her victims. She bravely criticized the government for providing absolutely no psychological aftercare for survivors of extreme violence. Despite battling late-stage cancer in recent years, she remains alive, having found peace in religion, outliving the monsters who tried to break her husband. The Pink House was bulldozed into the earth, but the scars remain. The Kaijon Park claimed they wanted to devour the rich, but they only ever consumed the innocent, and ultimately, themselves. Part III. Confidential Informant 112. For our final story, we travel to the humid, moss-draped city of Tallahassee, Florida. The year is 2008. Rachel Morningstar Hoffman was a 23-year-old psychology graduate with a smile that could disarm a bank robber. She was a vibrant, deeply empathetic young woman, radiating a fun-loving spirit that earned her the title of party animal in her high school yearbook. She carried that magnetic, carefree energy with her to Florida State University. Like thousands of college students, Rachel enjoyed indulging in marijuana. In today's shifting legal landscape, a bag of weed might turn you a fine, or nothing at all. But this was the early 2000s in the state of Florida. The war on drugs was an active, aggressive machine, and the law was engineered to crush. Despite her recreational habits, Rachel was brilliant. She earned her bachelor's degree in 2007. She wasn't aimless. She had a beautiful, ambitious vision for her future. She planned to enroll in culinary school, intent on developing a pioneering form of psychological therapy that stepped out of the sterile, clinical office environment. She wanted to heal people over the warmth of a stove, chopping vegetables, and sharing communal meals. That dream was completely obliterated by a traffic stop. In April of 2008, the flashing red and blue lights pulled Rachel over. The police searched her vehicle and discovered several ounces of marijuana and exactly 6 tablets of ecstasy. In the interrogation room, the detectives pressured her to give up the name of the supplier who sold her the pills. Rachel, possessing a stubborn sense of loyalty, refused to snitch. Most officers would have simply processed the paperwork and sent the college graduate to face the judge. But a Tallahassee police officer named Ryan Pender saw something else sitting across the table. He looked at Rachel's clean-cut, innocent appearance. He noted her absolutely blank criminal record. He smelled the palpable, suffocating fear of a young woman terrified of a prison cell. He didn't see a suspect. He saw bait. Officer Pender leaned across the table and presented Rachel with a horrific ultimatum. She could take the felony charges, kiss her culinary dreams goodbye, and likely rot in a state penitentiary. Or she could agree to go undercover in a high-stakes sting operation to help the department bag some major, violent players in the drug trade. Rachel was backed against a wall. The entire weight of her future was pressing down on her chest. Trembling, she agreed to become a confidential informant. The operation she was handed was bordering on suicidal. Her targets were two hardened, convicted felons, Deanie Low-Green and his brother-in-law, and Reyes Bradshaw. Our instructions were straightforward but terrifying. She was to drive her own car to Bradshaw's house. She would be wearing a hidden audio transmitter. She was instructed to purchase 1,500 ecstasy pills, 2 full ounces of cocaine, and a semi-automatic handgun. She would hand over $13,000 in marked police cash, and then casually walk away. Rachel had never fired a gun. She had never purchased hard narcotics. She had precisely 0 hours of law enforcement or undercover training. Yet, Officer Pender had just thrust this terrified 23-year-old into the center of the largest, most dangerous undercover sting operation in the history of the Tallahassee Police Department. Pender confidently assured her that the net was tight. He promised her that an army of 19 heavily armed officers backed by an aerial unit would be watching her every single move. He told her she was completely safe. He lied. On the evening of May 7th, the trap was set. The police taped a hidden wire inside Rachel's purse. Dressed casually in blue jeans, a vintage Grateful Dead t-shirt, and black flip-flops, Rachel climbed into her silver Volvo and drove out into the fading Florida sunlight, heading toward the dealer's home. The operation derailed almost instantly. While she was en route, Green and Bradshaw called her cell phone. They were paranoid. They abruptly changed the meeting location to Forest Meadows, a dense, heavily wooded park nearby. Rachel, assuming the invisible army of 19 officers was listening and adapting, dutifully turned her steering wheel and drove toward the trees. But the heavy canopy of the Florida oaks was too thick. The police helicopter circling high above lost visual contact with the silver Volvo. Down on the ground, a catastrophic breakdown in communication occurred. The officers in the unmarked pursuit vehicles all simultaneously assumed that someone else had eyes on the target. No one scrambled to reacquire visual contact. Rachel was completely alone. Still believing her protectors were hovering just out of sight, Rachel followed a sudden location change demanded by the dealers. They directed her to a deserted plant nursery about 1.5 miles north of the park. Minutes later, the hidden transmitter in her purse suffered a catastrophic malfunction. The audio feed to the command center dissolved into dead static. According to Officer Pender's official statement, Rachel managed to dial his cell phone directly at just before 7:00 p.m. Her voice was tense. "I followed them from the nursery," she told him. "We're on gut. It's a dead-end street." Pender claims he yelled into the receiver, turn around, do not follow them." But the line had already gone dead. At that exact same moment, Rachel's boyfriend received a chilling, final text message from her phone. "It's about to go down." By the time the panicked police units frantically scoured the map and finally swarmed the dirt of Gardner Road, the silver Volvo was gone. The dust was settling. On the empty road, the officers found a single spent .25 caliber shell casing, to live rounds of ammunition in the dirt, and one lone, black flip-flop. Hours ticked by. The Tallahassee Police Department, rather than admit their catastrophic failure, actually floated the vile theory to the press that Rachel had orchestrated a double-cross and fled the state with the $13,000. They even raided her boyfriend's home, expecting to find her hiding under a bed. 2 days later, the agonizing waiting game ended. 50 miles southeast of Tallahassee, in the quiet, rural town of Perry, investigators approached a deep, vine-choked ravine. At the bottom of the ditch lay the body of confidential informant number 112, Rachel Morningstar Hoffman. She had been stuffed into a bright, ore-engine purple sleeping bag, her own t-shirt wrapped around her head. She had been executed, shot 5 times in the chest and head with the exact same semi-automatic handgun the police had sent her to purchase. The timeline of the murder was a tragedy of errors. When the deal was going down, Green and Bradshaw had searched her belongings. They found the wire hidden in the purse. Realizing it was a sting, they forced the terrified girl into a stolen BMW at gunpoint. As they drove toward the swamps, Rachel screamed into her purse, begging the 19 officers to save her. No one was listening. They shot her in the car and tossed her body into the ravine like a bag of trash. Green and Bradshaw were swiftly apprehended and confessed to the slaughter. On what would have been Rachel's 25th birthday, Green was sentenced to life, without parole plus 30 years. Bradshaw pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and received the exact same sentence. But the true villainy of the story rested behind a police badge. A grand jury took the incredibly rare step of issuing a blistering public rebuke of the Tallahassee Police Department. The department immediately shifted into aggressive damage control. The police chief at the time, Dennis Jones, went on national television for ABC News and committed an act of staggering moral bankruptcy. He actively painted the murdered 23-year-old as a hardened thug. "Yes, I'm calling her a criminal," the chief stated coldly to the cameras. Rachel Hoffman was committing crimes in the city of Tallahassee. "That's my job as a police chief, is to find these criminals in our community and to take them off the street." He said this about a girl who had never even seen the inside of a courtroom. He then took it a step further, blaming Rachel for her own execution, claiming she deviated from the plan by driving to Gardner Road. The journalist interviewing him was visibly stunned, pressing the chief if she's going off the plan. She's a 23-year-old recent college graduate. Why didn't your officers move in right then and there and shut the whole thing down? The chief stammered. That would have been ideal. This is my question. Why didn't that happen? Have you asked that simple question? I haven't asked that question because that's what we're finding out in the investigation, the chief deflected. Rachel's grieving parents refused to let the police department smear the blood of their daughter on her own memory. They fought back with the fury of a hurricane. They relentlessly reminded the public that the police had blackmailed a civilian with zero training and abandoned her in a dead-end street with 2 armed murderers. They forced the department to publicly admit they had broken their own operational guidelines. The officers involved were quietly suspended with pay. Officer Pender was fired, only to be quietly reinstated a short time later. Many still questioned the official narrative, wondering if Pender actually told Rachel to turn around, or if that was simply a convenient lie manufactured after the wire went dead to cover their tracks. Rachel's parents filed a massive wrongful death lawsuit against the city. They secured a $6 million settlement, but more importantly, they forced the 19 officers involved to issue a formal, written apology, an apology the department hadn't felt the need to offer on their own. The true victory, however, came in 2009. The state legislature officially signed Rachel's law into the books. It was a groundbreaking mandate that established strict, unforgiving protocols for law enforcement using confidential informants. It forces police to provide legal counsel, assess the actual risk to the civilian, and legally mandates that they protect the people they use as bait. Rachel's parents took the absolute darkest moment of their lives and forged it into a shield, ensuring that no other family would ever have to bury their child because the police department wanted a cheap arrest. But a law cannot bring back a daughter. Rachel's death was a spectacular, entirely preventable failure of the institutions designed to protect us. She was coerced into the dark, and when the monsters arrived, the people who put her there simply turned off the radio and walked away. Thank you for walking into the dark with me tonight. Remember to hit that like button, keep your doors locked, and I'll see you all again very soon. Welcome to the spaces where the world fractures. We like to believe that reality is a solid, predictable thing. We trust that the ground will hold our weight, that the people we watch on our screens are safe behind the glass, that the dead stay buried, and that when tragedy strikes, the living will respond with basic human decency. But what happens when those unspoken rules disintegrate? Tonight we are pulling back the curtain on 3 distinct, deeply unsettling fractures in reality. These are stories of profound terror, systemic failure, and the darkest depths of human depravity. Lock your doors. Lower the blinds. Let's begin. Part I. The Woods of Tennessee. There is a single, haunting image that sits at the center of this mystery. It is a frozen frame of video, captured by a hidden trail camera deep within the suffocating, dense woodlands of Mississippi. In the grainy, low-resolution picture, you see the back of a man. He is shirtless. His posture is rigid, strained with an undeniable, visceral desperation. In his hands, he appears to be clutching a thick, heavy tree branch, wielding it not as a walking stick, but as a weapon. To the general public, this image was an eerie, unexplained anomaly. But to a woman named Tiffany Carter, it was a waking nightmare. That was her son, and she knew, with the absolute certainty of a mother's intuition, that in the exact moment that photograph was taken, he was fighting for his life. His name was Rashi E.M. Carter. He was 25 years old, born and raised in the small community of Fayette, Mississippi. Rashi E.M. was known for 2 things: his relentless passion for sports, and the profound, all-consuming love he held for his 6-year-old daughter, Coley. He was a man with a vision. Before the pandemic ravaged the economy, Rashi M. had owned a small seafood restaurant. It had been forced to close its doors, but he was determined to rebuild. He was saving every penny to reopen his dream. Driven by this ambition, in the late autumn of 2022, Rashi M. took a grueling contract job at a Georgia Pacific chemical plant. He was assigned to a crew of temporary workers. They were housed in a cheap Super 8 motel in Laurel, making a daily 20-mile commute to the sprawling industrial site in the small, insular town of Taylorside. The crew was a rough mix of men, many from out of state, and very quickly, a dark, hostile dynamic began to fester. Rashi M was the outsider. He didn't fit in, and the crew made sure he knew it. On September 29th, the simmering tension boiled over into genuine fear. Rashi M picked up his phone and typed a long, detailed text message to his mother, Tiffany. "Me and the owner of this company aren't seeing eye to eye, Mama," he wrote her. The words that followed were a chilling premonition. "If anything happens to me, he's responsible for it. He's got these guys wanting to kill me." 2 days later, on Saturday, October 1st, the nightmare began to unfold. Rashi M managed to secure a ride to the plant with a few colleagues he still tolerated. But when the shift ended, they inexplicably abandoned him. He was stranded in Taylorside, miles away from his motel. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Rashi M started walking, desperately searching for a ride. While navigating the dusty outskirts of the town, his panic reached a breaking point. He FaceTimed his mother. Through the screen, Tiffany saw the sheer terror in her son's eyes. Breathless, he told her he was being hunted. He said a group of white men driving 3 separate pickup trucks were actively chasing him through the streets, screaming racial slurs from the open windows. Desperate for sanctuary, Rash EM sprinted into a local Family Dollar store. He ducked behind the aisles, trying to catch his breath. But, as he hid, he overheard a terrifying exchange. The cashier was on the phone. Rashi M heard her say, "Yeah, he's in here." The trap was closing. Tiffany, listening to the horror unfold in real time, told her son to run to the only place that should offer protection, the police station. Rashi M bolted from the store and sprinted to the Taylorside Police Department. But when he arrived, the building was empty. The doors were locked. No officers were present. Running on pure adrenaline, he spotted a marked cruiser at a nearby Exxon gas station. He rushed the officer, frantically explaining that he had been in a severe altercation with his co-workers, that he was being stalked, and that he feared for his life. He begged the officer for a ride back to the safety of his motel in Laurel. The officer looked at the terrified young man and coldly refused, citing that Laurel was outside his jurisdiction. The officer did, however, allow Rashi M to follow him back to the now unlocked station. Rashi M sat in the sterile lobby for an hour, trying to lower his heart rate. Still on the phone with his mother, he asked the officers if he could simply sit in the lobby out of sight until he could arrange his own transportation home. The police denied his request. They kicked him out into the night. Where Rashi M slept that night remains a mystery. But at 5:00 and the following morning, he reappeared at the same police station. He was exhausted, desperate, and his phone was dying. He asked to borrow a charger so he could contact his family. The officers, rather than helping him, simply pointed him back to the Family Dollar. With his battery bleeding out at 1%, Rashi M sent a final, desperate GPS spin of his location to his mother. Tiffany, paralyzed by distance in Philadelphia, scrambled to find help. She frantically coordinated with a friend, a woman named Miss Green, begging her to drive to Taylorside and extract her son. Miss Green folded. She arrived at the family door, but the parking lot was empty. She drove up and down the quiet, rural streets of Taylorside. She asked the locals. She checked the alleys. Rashi M. Carter had vanished into thin air. Tiffany contacted the local law enforcement, her voice shaking with panic. The response she received was infuriating. The officers actually scolded her. They blamed Rashi M for disobeying them by not staying at the station, a station they had explicitly kicked him out of while Tiffany listened on the phone. Days bled into weeks. The silence was deafening. Desperate for progress, Tiffany contacted the Smith County Sheriff's Office, the higher authority overseeing Taylorside. The answer she received stopped her heart. The local police had never even informed the sheriff that Rashi M was missing. There was no official search. Realizing they were completely on their own, the Carter family organized a grassroots search party. They descended on Taylorside, retracing RSEM's final steps. They marched into the Family Dollar and demanded to see the security tapes. The staff complied, showing footage of Rash EM exiting the store at 10:00 am on the morning he vanished. When the family asked if the police had reviewed the footage, the employees shook their heads. The police had never even asked. Then, a local property owner came forward with something deeply disturbing. He handed over an image captured by a motion-activated trail camera on his lap. It was the haunting frame. The timestamp read for 32 p.m. Rash EM was deep in the woods. Shirtless, clutching the heavy branch, Tiffany studied the image, her eyes drawn to dark, unnatural shapes on her son's head and left arm. The police lazily dismissed them as shadows. Tiffany knew they were brutal, violent bruises. The police claimed that the branch Rash EM was holding was likely just a piece of debris. But when you look closely at the environment, specifically a deer feeder tripod nearby, you realize there were no loose branches around. Rash EM had deliberately armed himself. Why was he in the woods? Who was he hiding from? The police claimed they possessed the full video, asserting no one else was visible in the frame, but they refused to release the footage to the public or the family. The agonizing wait ended exactly 1 month later, on November 2nd, 2022. Searchers pushing through the dense, unforgiving brush of those exact same woods stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Rash EM, but he was not intact. His remains were catastrophically scattered across 2 entire acres of wilderness. His head was discovered 300 yards away from the location of the trail camera. It had been completely severed from his torso and stripped entirely to the bone. His spinal cord was located in a completely different sector of the forest. In total, investigators recovered 24 scattered bones and fragments, along with his jeans, his driver's license, his motel key card, and the battery from his iPhone. The shirt he was wearing in the store, and the iPhone itself, were gone. They have never been found. Despite the decapitation, the severed spine, and the vast scattering of remains, the local law enforcement swiftly, almost eagerly, closed the book. They officially labeled the cause of death as undetermined, but forcefully declared there was absolutely no reason to suspect foul play. They spun a narrative that Rash EM had simply wandered into the woods, perhaps overdosed on illicit drugs, a claim backed by zero toxicological evidence, and was subsequently consumed by wild animals. It is true that scavengers will scatter remains, but animals do not chase a man into the woods. Animals do not force a man to arm himself with a heavy branch. The community of Taylorside, a place burdened with the dark historical reputation of a sundown town, began to whisper. A chilling rumor circulated through the local schools. A young boy had allegedly told his classmates that he had seen a human body dumped in a hog pen, claiming the pigs had vomited up the remains. When LazyMasquerade's grieving family organized a peaceful protest in the center of Taylorside in February of 2023, demanding a federal investigation, they were not met with sympathy. They were met with a mob. A group of local men surrounded the peaceful demonstrators, hurling verbal abuse and violent threats. According to a terrified, anonymous diner employee, these same men were known to hold secretive, closed-door meetings with the local police chief in the days following LazyMasquerade's death. The police chief's own actions did nothing to dispel the air of hostility. He posted a photograph to his public Facebook page, showing a man using a high-pressure hose to blast away sidewalk chalk art that read, "Rash EM's life mattered." The chief's caption was brief and mocking, "Little clean up," followed by a waving hand emoji. Famed civil rights attorney Ben Crump took on the case, his words cutting through the official narrative. "There's nothing natural about this case. It screams out for justice. What we have here is a Mississippi lynching." The Carter family pointed to glaring inconsistencies. Bank records showed that someone had used LazyMasquerade's debit card to withdraw $500 from an ATM to full days after he vanished into the woods. The police fiercely disputed this, claiming they found all of his cards in the forest, rendering the withdrawal impossible. By the time investigators finally bothered to seek out LazyMasquerade's co-workers for questioning, the vast majority of the crew had already packed up and fled the state. The authorities cleared them all, stating their self-owned GPS data didn't place them in Taylorside on the day in question. Today, the woods of Mississippi hold their secrets tightly. The family continues to fight, screaming for the U.S. Department of Justice to intervene. The local authorities, buckling slightly under the immense national pressure, have quietly amended their stance, now admitting that foul play cannot be entirely ruled out. But the questions remain, echoing through the trees. Why was a terrified young father denied sanctuary by the police? What happened to his phone? And who was hunting Rashi M. Carter in the dark? Taylorside is a town of only 1,200 people. Someone knows exactly what happened, but whether bound by a sickening loyalty or paralyzed by fear, their mouths remain sewn shut. Part II, the rainstorm and the ride. Our second descent takes us across the Atlantic to the flat, rain-swept landscapes of the Netherlands. It was a Friday evening, the kind of day where the sky hangs low and heavy with grey clouds, and Faber, a vibrant 25-year-old student living in Utrecht, found herself caught in a sudden torrential downpour. She sought brief shelter, pulled out her phone, and decided to take a goofy selfie to send to her boyfriend. In the photograph, she is soaked to the bone. She is grimacing playfully at the camera, her fingers held up in a casual peace sign. It was a mundane, fleeting moment of humor. She hit send. Minutes later, and Faber would cross paths with a predator and fall off the face of the earth. And as a force of nature, she was balancing the intense academic pressure of a master's degree in cultural economics with a rich, bustling social life. She harbored a massive ambition to one day sit at the helm of a major international museum. She was determined, focused, and deeply loved by a wide circle of friends. To manage the stress of her demanding schedule, and relied on a classic Dutch escape, cycling. She loved nothing more than clipping on her helmet, mounting her bike, and disappearing into the lush, quiet countryside to clear her head. On September 29th, 2017, at approximately 5:00 p.m., and pushed off from her home, embarking on a planned 20-kilometer route. The ride started peacefully, but the weather quickly turned. At 6:50 p.m., the storm hit. Soaking wet, she snapped the peace sign selfie and fired it off to her boyfriend, Nathan. It made him smile. But the smile faded as the evening dragged on. By 8:00 p.m., the storm had passed, but Anne had not returned. Nathan's texts went unread. His calls went straight to voicemail. A creeping, icy dread settled in his stomach. By 9:00 p.m., unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, he called Anne's mother. The police were notified. Before the authorities could fully mobilize, Anne's friends and family took to the dark, rain-slicked woods themselves. Armed with nothing but flashlights and desperation, they scoured the cycling paths, calling her name into the void until physical exhaustion forced them to stop. As the sun rose the next morning, a massive, coordinated search grid was activated. 30 officers swept the route. Police helicopters chopped through the sky, utilizing military-grade thermal imaging cameras to hunt for a heat signature in the dense brush. Nothing. It was as if she had evaporated. The silence held for agonizing days. Then, on October 3rd, the first crack in the mystery appeared. A search party stumbled upon a dark jacket discarded near the cycling path. It belonged to Anne. 2 days later, on October 5th, searchers dredging a dark, murky pond in Below Ida Al Park hooked something heavy. They pulled it to the surface. It was Anne's bicycle. The following day, her soaked backpack was found discarded in the same area. The physical evidence was mounting, but it offered no direction, until the forensic technicians analyzing the recovered jacket isolated a microscopic trace of 4 on DNA. When they ran the profile through the national database, the computer returned a direct match. The DNA belonged to a 27-year-old man named Michael Pan Hughes. The profile of the suspect sent shockwaves through the police department. Michael Pan Hughes was not a ghost. He was a known, highly dangerous entity. In 2010, he had been convicted of a horrific crime, the violent, armed sexual assault of 2 teenage girls. He had arrogantly described the assault as a dream come true. He was currently serving a long-term sentence, housed in a specialized psychiatric facility in the town of Den Dolbe, receiving treatment for severe aggression and heavy substance addiction. The tactical units did not handle the arrest delicately. Knowing the extreme volatility of the monster they were hunting, the police breached his location with overwhelming force, physically tackling him to the ground and fracturing his shoulder in the process. Once in the interrogation room, the detectives employed intense, strategic pressure. They boxed him in with the DNA evidence. Eventually, the arrogant facade cracked. Michael confessed. The timeline he provided was a devastating sequence of horrific luck and absolute malice. Michael explained that on the evening of the storm, he had been granted an unsupervised, temporary leave from the psychiatric clinic, a standard, albeit controversial, part of his reintegration process. He had taken his motorized scooter out for a ride in the rain. As he navigated the slick paths, he lost control and accidentally collided with Anne, knocking her violently from her bicycle. At first, it was just a traffic accident, but when Anne, shaken and injured, reached for her phone and insisted on calling the police to report the crash, a switch flipped in Michael's brain. His scooter was uninsured. He was on leave from a psychiatric prison. He knew the police arriving would mean an immediate return to a locked cell. Panic morphed into predatory violence. He produced a knife. He snatched Anne's phone from her hand and smashed it into pieces, destroying her only lifeline. At knife point, he forced the terrified young woman off the path and deep into the isolating cover of the woods. There, he subjected her to a brutal, unspeakable assault. Following the violation, he bound Anne's wrists tightly with heavy plastic zip ties. He forced her onto the back of his scooter and drove her through the dark to the desolate, sprawling terrain of the Soesterberg base. In the crushing isolation of the base, Michael panicked again. He realized that if Anne screamed, someone might eventually hear her. To silence her forever, he took his blade and violently slit her throat. With Anne dead, the frantic cover-up began. He discarded her belongings in the pond. He stole his mother's car, loaded Anne's body into the trunk, and drove to a secluded, childhood haunt in Zeewolde. Under the cover of darkness, he dug a grave and buried her husband. Then, demonstrating a terrifying, psychopathic detachment, Michael drove home. He meticulously scrubbed the interior of his mother's car. He visited his family. He spent time with his pregnant girlfriend. And he calmly returned to using drugs, acting as if the slaughter in the woods had been nothing more than a bad dream. Following his confession, on October 12th, Anne's body was finally recovered from the earth. During the trial, Michael fiercely maintained that the murder was a spontaneous, panic-driven accident, triggered solely by the crash. But behavioral profaners, and the public were deeply skeptical. Michael suffered from borderline personality disorder, severe antisocial traits, and a documented history of psychopathic, predatory violence. Many believe he did not crash by accident. They believe he was hunting in the rain, watching Anne from the shadows, and that the selfie she sent her boyfriend was taken mere minutes before he struck. The trial exposed a catastrophic, systemic failure within the Dutch justice and mental health systems. How was a highly volatile, violent sexual predator permitted to leave a secure psychiatric clinic 3 times a day, completely unsupervised? How did he manage to smuggle a lethal blade back through the facility's security checkpoints? In July 2018, the judge handed down a sentence of 28 years in prison, to be followed by indefinite, locked psychiatric detention. But the tragedy of Faber ripped the blinders off the Netherlands. The subsequent government inquiry revealed a terrifying lack of communication. The psychiatric clinic in Den Dolder explicitly testified that they had absolutely no idea Michael had been convicted of armed sexual assault. Due to strict, rigid privacy laws designed to protect offenders, Michael had simply refused to sign the paperwork, allowing the prison to share his full criminal history with the doctors treating him. They only knew he was aggressive. The public outrage was deafening. How could a system protect the privacy of a monster at the cost of a young woman's life? Massive reforms swept through the institutions. The government implemented significantly stricter leave policies, mandated comprehensive risk assessments, and tore down the bureaucratic walls that prevented interagency communication regarding violent offenders. And Faber's ambition to run a museum was stolen from her. But her horrific death sparked a revolution in the justice system. The laws written in the wake of her murder are a grim, enduring legacy, a system desperately trying to ensure that no one else ever goes for a bike ride in the rain and never comes home. Part II, the Dotu's harvest. For our final descent, we travel to the sweltering, agricultural outskirts of Medan, located in North Sumatra, Indonesia. In this rural landscape, superstition and the supernatural hold immense, tangible power, and wielding that power was a man named Ahmad Sur Adije. To the authorities, he was simply a cattle breeder, but to the locals, he was known by a title that commanded absolute respect and deep fear: Datu. Sur Adije was a revered dukun, a shaman, a mystic, a witch doctor. People, primarily desperate women, flocked to his modest home from all corners of the province. They came seeking the impossible. They handed over staggering sums of money, up to $400 a visit, a massive fortune in rural Indonesia, to purchase his services. They bought vials of love potions. They paid for complex fertility rituals. They sought enchanted trinkets guaranteed to manifest wealth and physical beauty. They begged for dark spells designed to blind their straying husbands to other women. Sur Adije was selling hope. But behind the heavy curtain of ritual smoke enchanted incantations, the Datu was harvesting something far darker. On the evening of April 24th, 1997, a 21-year-old woman named Shriek Amal Adui made a fateful decision. Her marriage had fractured, and she was desperate to bring her estranged husband back home. She decided to seek the legendary power of the Datu. Under the cover of darkness, likely to avoid the deep social stigma associated with practicing black magic, Dewey flagged down a teenage rickshaw puller named Andreas. She climbed into the carriage and ordered him to take her to Sur Adije's residence in the remote village of SC. Isimayang. She explicitly instructed the teenager to keep his mouth shut about her destination. They arrived at the shaman's home just before the stroke of midnight. Dewey stepped out into the humid night air, paid Andreas, and told him she wouldn't be needing a ride back. It is a terrifying thought. Did she intend to walk miles home in the pitch black? Or did she truly believe the ritual would be so swift she could slip back into her bed before anyone noticed she was missing? The sun rose, and Dewey was gone. Her panicked parents scoured the chaotic streets of Maiden, thrusting a photograph of their beautiful daughter into the faces of strangers, begging for a beautiful daughter. 3 days dragged by in agonizing silence. Miles away from the city, a local farmer was trekking through a massive, sprawling sugarcane plantation, searching for fresh feed for his livestock. The region had been battered by heavy, torrential rains. The deluge had turned the earth into thick mud, washing away the topsoil. As the farmer pushed through the towering, razor-sharp stalks of cane, roughly 10 meters deep into the field, he stopped. The earth was disturbed. A strange, unnatural mound of dirt rose from the mud. Unease prickling his skin, the farmer rushed back to the village and alerted the local headman. A small posse of men was quickly assembled to investigate the anomaly. Among the men holding shovels was the village's most respected figure, Ahmad Sur Adije. The men waded into the plantation and began to dig into the mound. Almost immediately, a sickening, putrid stench erupted from the broken earth. It was thick, gagging, and unmistakably the smell of death. They kept digging. The shovels hid flesh. Buried in the shallow grave was the disrobed body of a young woman. The local police were summoned, and the horrific discovery reached Dewey's mother. She rushed to the plantation. When the tarpaulin was pulled back, she took one look at the feet protruding from the mud and collapsed. It was Dewey. But one chilling detail stood out to the investigators examining the crime scene. Dewey's body had not simply been dumped. She had been positioned. Her head was twisted, facing a very specific, deliberate direction, directly toward the home of Ahmad Sur Adije. The investigation might have stalled there, another tragic mystery buried in the mud. But the teenage rickshaw puller, Andreas, heard the news of the discovery. His conscience overrode his promise of secrecy. He marched into the police precinct. Dewey said that she wanted to go to the witch doctor's house. He told the detectives, "I was curious because it was a little late, so I asked her why she was going there. She scolded me and told me not to be so nosy." It was the thread that unraveled the monster. The police mobilized immediately, raiding the Data's home. The search was brief. Tucked away inside the residence, they found Dewey's handbag, her dress, and her bracelet. Sitting in the interrogation room, Sur Adije initially played the victim. spinning a flimsy lie that he had simply stumbled upon the items while walking through the fields. The detectives tightened the screws. The physical evidence was insurmountable. Slowly, the dam broke. Sora DJ, I confessed to strangling Dewey. But he didn't stop there. With a chilling, detached calmness, the shaman admitted to killing 16 other women. The detectives, horrified, returned to his home and tore it apart. Hidden in the floorboards and cabinets, they uncovered a massive stash of jewelry, watches, and clothing. They matched the items to 25 more open missing persons cases. Faced with the trophies of his slaughter, Sora DJ finally laid bare the true scale of his madness. He formally confessed to murdering 42 women over an 11-year reign of terror, from 1996 to 1997. The mechanics of his ritual were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. A desperate woman would arrive at his door, seeking salvation. He would demand his exorbitant $400 fee up front. He would then lead the terrified, hopeful woman deep into the claustrophobic darkness of the sugarcane plantation. He would instruct her to dig a deep hole in the earth. He told her this was a sacred, necessary component of the magic. He would command her to step into the pit and bury herself up to her waist, trapping her legs in the compacted soil so she could not run. Standing over the paralyzed woman, he would begin his chanting. He would kneel in the mud, reach his hands forward, and wrap a length of heavy cable around her throat. He would strangle the life out of her as she helplessly fought against the earth holding her down. When the struggle finally ceased, the Doctor would perform the true, sickening core of the ritual. He would lean down, press his mouth to the lips of the corpse, and violently suck the pooling saliva from the dead woman's mouth. Why? Why the saliva? Why the positioning? Sora DJ, I revealed that he was acting on the direct orders of a ghost. He claimed that his deceased father, a man named Jorgan who was also a practitioner of the dark arts, had visited him in a vivid, terrifying dream. The apparition delivered a chilling prophecy. Drink the saliva of 70 dead women, and your magical powers will become absolute. You will achieve invincibility. Sora DJ took the spectral command and applied a sociopathic efficiency to it. My father didn't specifically advise me to kill people, he casually explained to the police. But I was thinking it would take ages to find 70 women who had passed from natural causes. I was trying to hit my target as fast as possible. I took my own initiative. He stripped their bodies to accelerate the rotting process and explicitly twisted their necks so their dead eyes would forever stare at his home, acting as spiritual batteries to charge his dark magic. The sugarcane plantation was transformed into an excavation site. Dozens of police officers with shovels systematically tore up the fields. They unearthed a nightmare. Pile after pile of skeletal remains were pulled from the earth. All female, all pointing toward the Data's house. The youngest victim pulled from the mud was a child of only 11 years old. The vast majority of the 42 bodies were never claimed. They remain unidentified. Investigators deduced the tragic reason why. The social stigma of visiting a black magic practitioner was so profound that families were too ashamed to admit their missing daughters had sought out the Dato, severing the only link that could have caught him years earlier. The horror escalated when Sora DJ revealed he did not act alone. He possessed 3 wives, who were all biological sisters. They helped him launder the money and actively advertised his services to vulnerable women. But the eldest sister, too many, was the true accomplice. Because Sora DJ only killed at night, many of the clients were terrified to walk into the towering sugarcane alone. Too many would accompany them, acting as a comforting, maternal presence, lulling the victims into a false sense of security before helping her husband bury them alive. The trial was a media sensation. On December 11, 1997, prosecutors dropped a staggering 363-page indictment on the defense table. Realizing he was facing the firing squad, Sora DJ suddenly retracted his confession, claiming the police had physically tortured the story out of him. The jury didn't buy a single word. In 2008, Amon Sora DJ was marched out to a remote clearing. He was bound tightly to a wooden post. A line of rifles was raised. The Data's quest for immortality ended in a hail of gunfire. His accomplice, Too Many, originally sentenced to death, had her punishment reduced to life in a concrete cell. The other 2 sister wives were controversially released. The local villagers, furious at the perceived lack of justice, formed a mob and burned the shaman's home to the ground, forcing the sisters to flee into the jungle. Amansura DJI set out to harvest 70 souls. He officially confessed to 42. But looking at the vast, sprawling expanse of the sugarcane fields, investigators shudder at the mathematical probability. The cane still grows tall and maiden, but the locals whisper that the sugar harvested from that specific plantation tastes different now. It is bitter. They avoid the fields at night, terrified of what might still be buried in the mud, waiting to be found. Thank you for walking into the dark with me tonight. Remember to hit that like button. Keep your doors locked. And I'll see you all again very soon.